Imagine a world where a person's body becomes a battleground of desire, obsession, and control. A life in which freedom is stripped away and every glance, touch, and action is dictated by the whims of those who claim to own you. In this world, even uniqueness, the very traits that make someone extraordinary, can become a source of fascination, fear, and exploitation. Today, I want to take you into such a story of obsession, power, and the human cost of desire unrestrained. Throughout history, slavery has represented one of the most extreme violations of human rights and personal autonomy. Enslaved individuals were treated not as people with emotions, desires, and agency, but as property, commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited according to the whims of their owners. In certain periods and regions, this system extended beyond labor and domestic service into the most intimate and invasive aspects of a person's life, including their bodies and sexuality. Slavery created a legal and social framework in which one human being could exercise complete control over another, erasing any sense of personal freedom or consent. Within this environment, power dynamics were not merely hierarchical, they were absolute in the most intimate sense. The enslaved were expected to comply, to endure, and to accept roles imposed upon them by force, often under threat of violence or punishment. The psychological toll of such a system was immense, yet it was largely invisible to those who benefited from it. In this context, the presence of a hermaphrodite or intersex individual introduced a layer of fascination and anxiety. Societies that practiced slavery often lacked understanding or compassion for those whose bodies did not conform to binary norms. The unusual biological characteristics of an intersex person could provoke curiosity, fear, and desire among slave owners and their families. Because slaves were seen as objects rather than human beings, the line between medical curiosity, personal interest, and sexual exploitation often became blurred. The master and his family might perceive the hermaphrodite not as a person with feelings and autonomy, but as an object of intrigue and a symbol of novelty. This distorted perception allowed them to act on obsessive impulses without regard for morality or the humanity of the enslaved individual. The historical reality of slavery also created circumstances in which taboo desires could manifest unchecked. In households where power was concentrated and societal norms were defined by ownership, masters and mistresses could indulge impulses that would otherwise be condemned. The intersection of slavery and the unusual physical identity of a hermaphrodite amplified these dynamics, creating a scenario where obsession and control could coexist with fascination and fear. Within these oppressive frameworks, the enslaved individual became a vessel through which the master's desires, curiosities, and insecurities were projected. They were stripped not only of freedom, but also of identity, reduced to the sum of their physical and symbolic attributes in the eyes of those who claimed dominion over them. This exploitation reflects the darkest aspects of human history, where cruelty, curiosity, and desire converge in ways that devastate the lives of the powerless. The concept of identity and otherness plays a crucial role in understanding the experience of a hermaphrodite or intersex individual in historical contexts, particularly within the institution of slavery. Intersex individuals whose physical traits do not align strictly with male or female norms have historically been subjected to misunderstanding, fear, and objectification. Their bodies challenge the rigid binary categories that most societies have used to define gender, creating a sense of otherness that both fascinates and unsettles those who encounter them. In the context of slavery, where people are already dehumanized and treated as property, this otherness is amplified. The enslaved individual is not only denied agency, but is also rendered exotic, strange, or abnormal in the eyes of the owners, heightening the intensity of their scrutiny and obsession. This fascination is rarely benign. It often crosses into exploitation, manipulation, and abuse as the enslaved person becomes a subject of curiosity, a spectacle, or a vessel for desire. Otherness in this context is not merely a physical distinction. It carries significant psychological and social implications. For the hermaphrodite, the experience of being seen as fundamentally different imposes a constant pressure to navigate an environment defined by control and judgment. The master and his wife, for instance, may project their fantasies, insecurities, or obsessions onto the individual, interpreting the unusual physical traits as symbols or signs of mystical, sexual, or exotic value. This projection transforms the person into an objectified entity, simultaneously desired and feared, observed and controlled. The psychological burden of being treated as other is compounded by the absence of freedom or choice, leaving the hermaphrodite vulnerable to manipulation and obsession in ways that are both intimate and invasive. The dynamic of otherness also exposes broader societal attitudes toward bodies and identities that deviate from the norm. Intersex individuals were often fetishized because their differences were seen as curiosities rather than as natural human variations. The lack of understanding about biological diversity allowed slave owners to impose their desires without moral or ethical restraint. In these circumstances, the enslaved person becomes a mirror reflecting the psychological complexities, anxieties, and fixations of those in power. They are forced into roles that are constructed entirely by the perceptions of others, never by their own choices or inclinations. This relationship between otherness, fascination, and obsession underscores the interplay between identity, power, and dehumanization, showing how the uniqueness of an individual can be distorted into a tool for exploitation in a world where freedom and humanity are denied. The psychology of obsession emerges when desire, power, and secrecy intertwine, creating a powerful and often destructive force that can overwhelm individuals and relationships. In the context of slavery, obsession is intensified by the absolute control exerted over the enslaved person, as their autonomy is entirely denied and their existence becomes defined by the needs, desires, and fantasies of those who hold power. When the master and his wife become fixated on a hermaphrodite slave, the obsession is fueled not only by physical desire but also by the thrill of transgression and the allure of what is forbidden or unusual. The unusual physicality of the individual, combined with their inability to resist or reject attention, creates a scenario in which both fascination and compulsion can escalate unchecked, consuming the minds and emotions of those who hold power. The enslaved person becomes more than an individual. They transform into a symbol or object upon which psychological projections are cast, amplifying the intensity of obsession. Obsession thrives in secrecy, particularly when societal norms or personal morals are circumvented by absolute control. Within the confines of the household, hidden from public scrutiny, masters and mistresses may indulge impulses that they would otherwise suppress, rationalizing their actions through power, entitlement, or the perception that the enslaved individual exists solely for their satisfaction. This environment of secrecy allows obsessions to grow without restraint, feeding on the thrill of domination and the perceived uniqueness of the enslaved person. The psychological effect on the master and mistress is profound. Desire shifts from simple attraction to a compulsion, a need to possess, monitor, and control, often accompanied by jealousy, anxiety, and rivalry. Their fixation is no longer merely physical. It becomes entwined with identity, ego, and emotional dependency, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that consumes their attention and clouds their judgment. For the enslaved individual, The psychological consequences are devastating. They are trapped at the center of a vortex of desire and obsession, stripped of agency and forced to navigate emotions projected onto them by others. They are objectified, scrutinized, and controlled, often reduced to a reflection of the obsessions around them rather than a person in their own right. This dynamic illustrates how obsession is not simply a personal failing, but a phenomenon that arises from power imbalances, secrecy, and the dehumanization of others. It reveals the darker aspects of human psychology, where desire and control can merge to create a toxic fixation that dominates both the beholder and the object of their obsession, highlighting the destructive potential of unchecked emotional intensity when combined with absolute authority and deprivation of autonomy. Power dynamics are at the core of understanding the relationships between masters, their families, and enslaved individuals, especially in scenarios involving obsession or extreme desire. In slavery, power is absolute and multidimensional, encompassing physical control, economic dominance, legal authority, and psychological manipulation. The enslaved person exists within a system that denies them agency, treating them as property whose body, labor, and even emotions can be controlled at the whim of the master. In such an environment, obsession is not only possible, but is intensified because the power imbalance allows desires to manifest without resistance. The hermaphrodite slave, whose body is already perceived as unusual or intriguing, becomes a focal point for the projection of fantasies, fears, and compulsions. The inability of the enslaved individual to assert boundaries, coupled with their physical and social vulnerability, makes the dynamics of obsession deeply toxic and often all-consuming. The relationship between master, mistress, and enslaved person demonstrates how power can distort desire and morality. Each act of attention or fixation is reinforced by the structure of dominance, allowing the obsessors to act without regard for ethics or consent. The master may feel entitled to possess and explore every aspect of the enslaved person's body and identity, while the wife may simultaneously experience a mixture of rivalry, desire, and complicity in the same system of control. The interplay of authority, entitlement, and secrecy magnifies obsession, creating an environment where both parties can become psychologically entangled with their victim. In such circumstances, the enslaved individual becomes a canvas upon which the master and wife project their needs, fears, and insecurities, reinforcing the sense of power and control while eroding the humanity of the person they dominate. Power dynamics in this context are not merely about physical domination. They extend to emotional and psychological manipulation. By controlling the enslaved individual's environment, monitoring their interactions, and dictating their every movement, the master and his wife maintain a form of authority that is totalizing and self-reinforcing. The enslaved person's responses, whether of fear, compliance, or subtle resistance, are interpreted and manipulated to further strengthen the obsessor's sense of control and uniqueness of their relationship with the individual. This dynamic highlights how obsession and desire are inseparable from structures of power when one party is utterly dependent on the whims of another. It also illustrates the moral corruption inherent in such systems, where desire becomes entwined with domination and objectification. The consequences of these power dynamics ripple outward, not only shaping the experiences of the enslaved person, but also transforming the masters themselves, binding them psychologically to their own compulsions, and blinding them to the humanity they suppress in others. The emotional and moral consequences of obsession and exploitation are profound, affecting not only the enslaved individual, but also those who wield power over them. In situations where desire and control intersect, the enslaver's own humanity becomes compromised as their fixation blinds them to the pain, dignity, and autonomy of the person they dominate. Obsession transforms simple desire into a consuming force that dictates thoughts, actions, and decisions, often overriding empathy, ethics, and rational judgment. The enslaved individual, whose life is entirely subjected to the whims of the master and his wife, becomes a vessel for these destructive emotions, carrying the weight of desires and compulsions that they cannot control or escape. This dynamic produces a cycle of psychological damage in which the enslaved person is dehumanized and objectified, and the obsessors are trapped by their own inability to moderate or recognize the moral corruption of their actions. The consequences extend beyond the immediate relationship, affecting the broader household or social environment. Obsession often breeds tension, rivalry, and jealousy between the master and mistress, creating emotional instability that can manifest in cruelty, punishment, or emotional manipulation. The enslaved person becomes a central figure in this turmoil, subjected to heightened scrutiny, conflict, and control, which compounds the trauma of their existence. The psychological impact of being treated as both an object of desire and a site of contention can be devastating, fostering fear, confusion, and a profound sense of isolation. In turn, the obsessors themselves may experience heightened anxiety, frustration, and emotional dependence on the enslaved individual, revealing how moral and emotional degradation can occur even among those who hold power. These consequences illuminate a broader human truth. When obsession and desire are divorced from compassion and moral accountability, they become destructive forces. The enslaved person suffers the direct harms of objectification and loss of autonomy, but the obsessors also experience a form of self-corrosion. Their identities become entangled with control and fixation, diminishing their capacity for empathy, ethical reasoning, and authentic human connection. Desire, when unchecked by morality, becomes a trap that ensnares both the powerful and the powerless, illustrating how human relationships can be warped when one party dominates and the other is denied agency. The narrative of obsession and exploitation is therefore not simply a story of physical or sexual domination. It is a profound exploration of psychological, emotional, and moral consequences, revealing the destructive ripple effects of power misused and desire uncontrolled. Stories like that of a hermaphrodite slave, shared between a master and his wife, serve as a mirror reflecting cultural and societal attitudes toward gender, sexuality, and power. They highlight the ways in which society has historically constructed norms around bodies and identities, often marginalizing those who do not conform to binary definitions of male and female. In a culture that prizes rigid gender categories and hierarchical social structures, individuals whose physical traits challenge these norms become subjects of fascination, fear, or exploitation. The hermaphrodite slave is not simply a unique person with a complex identity. They are treated as a symbol of difference, a marker of otherness, and an object upon which social anxieties and obsessions are projected. This societal gaze magnifies the vulnerabilities of the enslaved individual, as cultural perceptions of abnormality or exoticism intersect with the absolute power wielded by the master and his wife. The story also illustrates the dangers of dehumanization and objectification, showing how societal structures can enable extreme abuses. When a culture allows people to be categorized as property or curiosities, it fosters environments in which obsession, desire, and control can thrive unchecked. The enslaved person becomes a site upon which moral and ethical boundaries are suspended, and the individuals in power are free to indulge impulses without fear of social or legal repercussion. These historical patterns reveal how societal attitudes can shape human behavior, normalizing exploitation and desensitizing individuals to cruelty. The narrative forces reflection on how norms, prejudices, and cultural constructions of identity influence not only the treatment of others, but also the internal moral compass of those who exercise power. Furthermore, the story serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of obsession and unchecked desire within societal frameworks that condone inequality. The fascination and compulsion exhibited by the master and his wife demonstrate how cultural and structural power can amplify personal weaknesses, turning desire into domination and curiosity into exploitation. By examining this narrative, one can see the intricate interplay between individual psychology and societal values, showing how historical attitudes toward gender, sexuality, and power have tangible effects on human lives. It also invites reflection on contemporary parallels, highlighting the enduring relevance of ethical vigilance, empathy, and respect for human dignity. Such narratives compel us to confront uncomfortable truths about the intersection of societal norms and personal morality, emphasizing that the harm of objectification and obsession is magnified when reinforced by broader cultural structures and power imbalances.